Wow, that's a lot of food for thought. And I just want to say thank you to the organizers for this event. Despite being part of the organizing committee, I didn't fully understand really like the magnitude of what we're talking about today. And it just so far, we're an hour or so in and my mind is just buzzing with ideas, and it's really gotten me excited and energized. So it's my delight to introduce today Dr. Audrey Jamal, and she is an assistant professor in the Department of Management and the assistant dean in the Gordon S. Lang School of Business and Economics. Audrey is a community engaged researcher. Her research focuses on the role of community engagement in advancing local economies, and her research aims to build stronger, more resilient communities and looks at everything from community wealth building to newcomer integration, downtown renewal, and the sharing economy. Prior to joining Lang, Audrey served as a chief of staff in the office of the president at the University of Guelph. She has previously held executive roles in the not-for-profit sector and has an extensive background in project management, fundraising, and community engagement. So delighted to introduce her, and quite the biography here, and we can completely understand why you're joining us today. And please share just a fraction of your knowledge with us today and engage us in conversation. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Thank you. I know you've been listening for about an hour, so if people need to get up and grab a coffee, pop out, I totally understand. I've been teaching this semester, and it's been so fun because it's great to have students back in the class. My class is about 80 students, and I was thinking about your comments of how students have been online and now they're back in person. And my goodness, the energy of rooms is so fun. So I love being back in rooms with other humans. I did not do well in the online world. I don't know about you. I love that we made that digital leap together and that my parents figured out how to Zoom call, but honestly, to be back in communities talking about these issues is one of my dreams, so I'm delighted to be here. Had a great drive in from Guelph this morning, and I'm so glad I put on my winter picture. I debated, I said, is it too soon? It's November, can I do this for the picture? So thank you, Bonnie and team, for inviting me to be here today. It's great to see Heather in person because we've Zoomed. So I want to talk to you about something today, and is this the clicker? And I push the green one? Awesome, thanks. I'm a walker, so I might, I could be a little challenging on this. So I want to talk to you about the third pillar. And it's always tricky to follow Zita. I mean, even digitally, she's a tricky woman to follow because her knowledge is unbelievable. And we're really lucky that she's leading this conversation. So what I want to walk you through today are some slides that talk about the work we've been doing for about the last year and a half, and it's been guided by this philosophy that's been put forward of the third pillar. And Zita explained it well, is that in our world we have these three pillars, and I'll talk through it in my presentation, and I want to give a couple of examples of how the community economies pilot that we've been working on, and I was sort of the research partner for that project, so I want to tell you a little bit about that. Talk about the context we're in, talk about the third pillar, talk about community economies, and then some new emerging research I'm doing about this concept of community wealth building. And I love this term, and I've actually set as a personal goal in 2022, and I guess we're coming up on the end of it, to talk about it everywhere I go. And I'm excited to share some concepts with you. Oh, and I love that the slides are here. Terrific. That made my world a lot easier when I looked down. Okay, terrific. So, thinking of those three pillars of businesses, of governments, and community, Rajan, who puts this concept together, talks about how community is diminished. So the question I want you to think about as we're talking today and as we're going through this, and feel free to put up your hand as I'm talking. I know it's a lot to be sort of talked at, so I really want this to be a conversation. And if I've said something too quickly, feel free to just pause and ask a question. So the question I want you to think about as I'm going through these slides is what happens to a structure when one pillar is broken? So just think about that, right? Think about the imbalance. And I'll just tell you a little bit about myself so that you have a sense as to where I'm situated in this conversation. I didn't start working at the university until few years ago. I didn't actually join the faculty side up until about a year ago, but I've been doing a lot of work in community. So I came up through the not-for-profit sector, and I was really lucky to work in a couple of different not-for-profits. One was in Toronto, and I did immigrant and settlement services. My background, I'm the daughter of immigrants to Canada, and I was really lucky to work with diverse communities across Scarborough, where our NGO was. And then I moved to Guelph, and I thought, oh gosh, what do I do now, right? Had kids, I'm like, we're living in Guelph, my husband got transferred there. And I started working for the Business Improvement Association, the BIA, in downtown Guelph. Do people know the BIA model? A couple people. So it's a business association, but it's a little bit more than that too, because communities are part of it, right? So not-for-profit associations are part of it, residents are part of it, governments are part of it. And I got really curious, and I thought, okay, I'm going to go back to school. So I went back and I did my doctoral work at Waterloo, and it was in urban planning. And I became really interested in cities for a couple of different reasons. And it wasn't just about the buildings, because planners sometimes think about buildings, right? But I looked at the intersection of buildings and people and economy. So that's kind of how I came to this work. So here's the story I want to tell you. I want to talk a little bit about the context, and Heather did a great job situating us in this conversation. So the idea I want to put forward to you is that we have three intersecting challenges that are playing out in our communities right now. The first is this one, and we all saw way too many of these signs during the pandemic, right? Things were closed, people stayed home, communities struggled. And I know many of us live in places with little downtowns and bigger downtowns, and those main streets really suffered. And a lot of the work I do now is how do you have a main street recovery post-COVID? The other big challenge we saw over the past year were exposing deep systemic inequalities in our community. And these are things that we have to face head on in our institutions, in our communities, in ourselves. And this is a massive challenge that the world is facing now. Climate. And I'm not going to depress you. I promise I'm going to give you the flip side. I promise. I say this to students all the time. I said, we need to talk about the hard stuff, but I promise I'll give you the flip side of it too. And I chose three images that really struck me this year. This is a field in China, so this is a drought. This is in Pakistan. There were floods, and this all happened this year. This is in British Columbia, forest fires. I mean, these three intersecting challenges are really putting communities on the front lines of the world's most pressing global challenges. People around the world are dealing with these in their communities and in their homes. So I'm going to flip to the hopeful side, which is this great quote, and I love this book, and I encourage you to take a look at it. It came out a few years ago. And the quote that I say all the time is that power belongs to the problem solvers, and we're in a room of problem solvers today. And I'd like to say that that happens at the community level. So with those three intersecting challenges in mind, I want to show you the flip side of the pictures. And I love this picture. This one's out of the Bay Area in San Francisco. But this happened all over the world, right? So we have the pandemic. It's horrible. So what do? We figure, look at these circles. We figure out ways to be with people in really kind of clunky and awkward ways. But I think what it shows is this craving for human connection, even when we had to be separate. Libraries, I'm a huge fan of libraries, and boy, were they busier than ever. I know in our community in Guelph, my husband chairs the library board, so I got all the stats, like what's going on in the library. I got my stack of novels. They were busier than ever, and they found creative ways to start bringing people back in. So we masked up, and we found ways to get back together. These patios, I don't know how your communities look, but we took over the streets, and what a pleasure that is. Heather talked about how we're spending way too much time in our cars. This is in Montreal, where we often try and take a little road trip every summer. It happened in downtown Guelph, I'm sure in other downtowns nearby. People took back the streets, right? They said, these are our places. Parks, you think about what was happening in public spaces. When it came to those deep systemic inequities and racism, we also took back the streets in different ways, and there were protests around the world saying that Black Lives Matter, saying that systemic injustice needs to stop. Institutions took this on, and boy, we have a lot of work to do. But the upswing in attention to this issue was astonishing, and this was all during the pandemic. And climate, I often talk about Greta. I get to teach this really cool sustainability course, and I talk about how do young people face the climate crisis, and we have to find ways to be actors in our community. And Greta is sort of an international name and face, and she started climate protests around the world. So I won't go through this in detail because we've already talked about this kind of framing, but what I really want to focus on is kind of the last sentence, and it talks about by building our communities, we can create more resilient, equitable, and sustainable economies. And that really speaks to equity, it speaks to the climate crisis, and it speaks to this idea of economic resiliency, which I think is what we found as we came through the pandemic. So I'm hopeful, and I want to tell you a little bit about why. In Zita's presentation, she talked about this project that we started together called the Community Economies Pilot, and there were 3 partners, and I was brought in as the University of Guelph research partner. And I had a theory when I started this, and part of the research I do is with communities. I think that's because of where I came up through the not-for-profit sector. And I remember saying to Zita and others, I think that communities are way ahead of the academy. And I know there are other researchers in the room, and I think many of us feel that way, is that communities are leading and the academy needs to catch up. And boy, what I really don't like to do is to write things that just sit in books and papers and nobody cares about. I think we need to find better ways as academics to connect with communities, to understand what's happening in communities, to document that, to bring the data and sort of the rigor of research into that, and then to share it out. So that was really fun, and it's been great being part of that. So in order to understand the economy, and Heather, I loved your story about the transformation of your thinking, because I think I've had similar moments myself, so I smiled when you said that. Part of what I study is the economy and this idea of economic development. So what are the policies? What are the programs? What are the ways in which we build our economy? So as communities, what I want to put forward to you is sort of a bit of an understanding of what are we up against? And traditionally, when we built our economy, we did it through kind of those 2 pillars. So if you think of the 3, you've got business and governments and community. It was the 2 pillars that were really building our economies, right? And it was businesses and governments getting together, and often there were financial incentives in place. And it used to be called smokestack chasing when we used to do a ton of manufacturing, at least in the North American environment. So we'd build the big factory, we'd put some incentives in place, it would create some jobs, and everything was fine for a while. But I want to tell you the other side of the story. I was in Detroit last weekend. I'm doing this cool project between Windsor and Detroit and the Gordie Howe Bridge. Does anyone know about that new bridge? Fascinating project. We can talk about that on the break or later. This is an older picture of Detroit, but these policies and the way that business happened were highly extractive, right? So if you want to talk about it in academic terms, it's this capitalist economy with a highly extractive business model that essentially leaves community behind. Because what happens when plants close? And so many of our communities experience that, right? So as the global economy became more international, there was a decline in manufacturing jobs, outsourcing of jobs, leaving community vulnerable and leaving wealth outside of the community. Ontario has our very own Rust Belt, and I do a lot of work in what we call mid-sized cities, places of around 50 to 500,000. And I just named a couple here in Windsor, London, Sudbury, Peterborough, where we saw a loss of traditional manufacturing. What happens, right? Communities struggle, jobs leave. But we also know that these mid-sized cities are also part of broader regional economies, right? It's not just about that place. They often draw in from smaller rural communities as well. I'll pick on my city. I only do bad pictures of where I live, I promise this. So this is Guelph. And the other thing that happened at this time is, so just to orient where we were, 20th century, lots of manufacturing. As that begins to leave, we have another trend impacting us. And we talked a little bit about this today. We talked about that kind of large-scale retail format, right? So all of a sudden, what does that do to our downtowns? It pushes everything to the fringes. Everybody's getting in their cars and driving to big box retail. And there's a place for it maybe in our communities, but I'm working really hard to try and figure out what it is. It's highly car-oriented, and what it does is it hollows out the core of cities. And at the same time as we're building these large format retail, we're actually building a lot of housing that looks like this, right? So I grew up in a place like this in Scarborough, like lots of houses, and there's nowhere to walk to. There's something in planning we talk about, and it's kind of fun, is this popsicle test. Has anyone heard about the popsicle test? So it's pretty fun, right? So I have kids, they're a little bit older now. They still like popsicles. But it's the popsicle test is if your child can walk to the store, buy a popsicle, and walk home before it melts, right? Then you live in a community that is a little bit more complete. In a lot of these suburban areas, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to walk to. And I know the issues are even more significant in rural communities for young people as well. So this is what my downtown started to look like in Guelph. We saw a lot of empty buildings. We saw a lot of increase in crime. And And in rural communities, and this is where my husband grew up, so that's why I chose Wheatley, Ontario, which is near Windsor, sort of in that Chatham-Kent area. We also saw the loss of traditional economic base in rural communities as well. We saw farmland being consolidated into fewer farms, bigger farms. In that case, in Wheatley, lots of greenhouses as well. And, terms that come up around this were the kind of the brain drain or rural flight. And then I have a colleague who does a lot of work on shrinking cities where you see smaller populations, and that has a huge impact on the local economy. But I promise I'm not going to depress you because I'm going to tell you the other side of the story. So as all of this is happening, this is where we're situating economies now, we're seeing this rise of the knowledge-based economy. So as we move away from manufacturing, we're moving into something called the knowledge-based economy. And this is where knowledge is key, right? Where we need to have people who are innovating, who are clustered together, and very often it clusters in big cities. So lots of downtowns, and this is again Guelph, and so this tells the happier story of what began to happen, is they realized they had to respond to this. So as manufacturing is declining, knowledge economy is growing, how are smaller places beginning to respond to this? So in 2006, the province put in place something called Places to Grow, and it was all about finding ways to intensify the core areas of not just big cities, but smaller communities as well outside of that green belt. And so we're starting to see some changes that are beginning to happen in smaller communities as well, where they're looking at attracting the newer knowledge-based economy, they're looking at renewing their downtowns, they're opening creative and co-working spaces, and they're starting to adapt some of those buildings. So I showed you the slide of London that lost the Kellogg's plant. And in London, they're really building this new, it's going to be quite something from what I understand, a new kind of entertainment center with farmers markets and breweries. And it's a new place for community that's taking over where a traditional manufacturing plant was. In Guelph, you see a distillery here called the Spring Mill. That used to be an old refrigerator plant. And the bottom picture is actually the University of Waterloo School of Architecture in Galt, which is in Cambridge. So the change of how communities are responding to that decline of manufacturing by finding new and creative ways of using real estate. So that's kind of the context. And I want to talk to you about the pilot project that we got to work on with Zita and her team. We chose 5 pilot communities: London, Hamilton, Prince Edward County, Fogo Island, of course, that we were inspired by, and South Island, British Columbia. And part of what we were focused on was this question of how do we strengthen community economies? I'm not going to go through this. Every time I put a slide with a lot of text, I always think it looks better on my screen than it does on the big screen. But I'm happy to share this and talk to people because there's a lot of jargon in this world and there's lots of words that people use. But traditionally, as I mentioned, economic development is really about that pro-growth, wealth building. And then as community comes into the mix, it really begins to change the narrative. It starts to ask different kinds of questions. So it's less about how do we build and grow an economy, and it's more about how do we create quality of place and how do we keep wealth in communities. So this idea of a community economy, when we're talking about it, actually disrupts, and I like that word, it disrupts traditional pro-growth extractive approaches to economic development. You might also hear the term inclusive economies, and that's where you just have more people around the table that are working on removing some of the barriers and promoting well-being. The other thing is that, often when we talk about economies, we sort of look at the two things at the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and this is a really great visual that I often use in presentations. But the economy is about more than that. There's everything else that exists underneath it. And I often talk about sort of this idea of farmers markets and housing cooperatives. How do we do fundraising? Where do not-for-profits fit into it? So when we talk about the economy, it's not just those things at the tip of the iceberg, it's also everything that exists underneath. And as Zita mentioned, we were inspired by Fogo Island and the work that they'd done there. And they created something called a social enterprise. Are people familiar with the term of social enterprise? I know it comes up a lot. I see a couple yeses and a couple nos. It's really this idea that business can be a force for good. So it's how do you take profits from a business and reinvest them in other things that are going to improve social good. At its core, whether it's social finance or social enterprise, it's taking profits and kind of funneling it back into people and communities. So they did that in a couple of different ways. The inn was part of it, so the inn is a social enterprise, and many people, when they look at booking the inn and they see the cost, which I've done, and I haven't been, they go, wow. And Zita talks about economic nutrition labeling, and and where the money goes. And that money goes back into community. Same with Growler's ice cream. It's a little bit more affordable to get a scoop of ice cream out there than it is to stay at the inn. And it's this idea of how do we create a business with a social purpose? And I think so many businesses are beginning to think about that. And where I work at the university, I feel really lucky that I get to work with a lot of student entrepreneurs. We have this little student entrepreneurship center, and the students are thinking really differently. The world is really beginning to change. And because we're a business school, people think, oh, these students are going to go out and make tons of money and they're going to take over the world. And it's interesting at the University of Guelph, the students we talk to are really thinking, how are we going to change the world? And how do we use business as a force for good? So that's a thread that we try to weave through our conversations with students, and through our entrepreneurship center, we take on a bit of a different flavor. So I love it because I'm going off script. So Bonnie, you have to just shoot me a look. Okay, good. I like to tell stories because sometimes I think they stick better. We have, at the University of Guelph, we're known for agriculture, right? Canada's food university. So we have all these amazing food science students. And a food science student can get a job in so many amazing places these days. But often they come to us at the business school, and we're not kind of one of those roll up the drawbridge, we're a business school. We're a pretty inclusive business school. So the food science students often come to us, and they have these really neat ideas about removing sugar or gluten or adding something cool to a product. So we support them. And we say to them, okay, how are you going to make this project? And then we teach them kind of the entrepreneurial skills so that they can learn to bring it to market. And then we have judges and competitions and pitches, and it's really fun. But the message that we keep hearing from our students and what we really try and build in is, how do you step lightly with your business? So how are you more sustainable in your approach? That's a huge part of being a social enterprise. And also, how do you find creative ways to give back to your community? So it's really interesting to see that generation of entrepreneurs begin to think differently about businesses. Okay, I know I went on a bit of a tangent, but I'm going to take you back. So one of the communities I was lucky enough to get to work with was Prince Edward County. Do people know Prince Edward County? So what do you know about Prince Edward County? What are the things that jump out when I say it? And you can say anything. You didn't hold back. Okay, so we got wine in Prince Edward County. What else do you think? I love that answer. There is great wine in Prince Edward County, yes.
There was a long-term integrated plan put together by the Community Development Association
Oh, tell me more.
to change the economic development approach. It was through the Community Futures Corporation.
Yep.
They had an incredibly gifted executive director who I don't know how he did it, but he got his board to do outrageous things in terms of using this pot of government money to do strange things.
Uh-huh. Oh, good.
Oh, sorry.
You get a microphone now.
Does that help?
That's great.
Okay. And that's, I'm not exactly sure how old the plan is, whether it was 25 or 30 years, but it's been, now I have no idea if the plan's still operational or any of that kind of stuff, but that's how the whole shift of Prince Edward County to doing different things. And they even used government money to do investments in a software company, as an example, like a local kid who needed money to start growing his business. They took an equity position, which I think 3 or 4 years later brought them back like $5 or $6 million from their initial investment.
Yep.
And that stuff doesn't happen without some kind of courageous group of people doing it. But at the same time, they created the initiatives for the wine growers, for the hotels, for the integrated approach to, if you wanted a wine tour, you could get a hotel, you could get meal tickets at all these fancy restaurants, the whole approach. And then because Toronto and Kingston are just a few miles down the road, they sold the shit out of it. And they've reaped the benefits.
Okay, I love that answer. That was so comprehensive. I'm going to come back to some of the points you raised because they're really, really germane to this conversation. Anybody else? Okay, great. We're gonna chat. We're gonna chat on the break. Okay, so we talked about wine, and then I think the points that were made about kind of that community planning process that happened, and they really worked hard to put Prince Edward County on the map, and that was a really intentional decision. And part of that meant that they wanted to weave together their assets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And I want to talk about some of the flip side and some of the dangers of that too, because there was a reason they became involved in this pilot. And as powerful and strong and popular as Prince Edward County is, there's another side to that story that's actually equally as challenging for different reasons. And I think it's really important that we talk about that, and that kind of leads to where we want to go in terms of this community economies pilot, and how do we then bring community voices into economic planning. So the three partners that came to the table and formed a small group. Zita talked about that idea of, governance, or we use this kind of great term, and I like it. It's called architectures for collaboration. Don't you like that? Like, how are you going to build collaboration? What's the architecture for that? Well, this group, Thrive PEC, started to form, and it was the county foundation. And is there a foundation here on Perth? Are there community foundations? Yeah, thought so. Really powerful and interesting organizations. The municipality came to the table as well, and then Community Futures. So these were the three folks at the table. And as was mentioned really eloquently, Prince Edward County is an interesting place. It's standalone. They talk about themselves as an island, which I thought was really cool. And as I went there and visited several times, I started to see that. They also are home to one of the most well-known provincial parks in the province. And the part I wanted to touch on, and this is kind of the flip side, is that in 2020 and 2021, they saw an unbelievable amount of tourism. And you can probably all think of the reasons why, right? We were all told to stay home. We all stayed home. And then what could we do, right? So we could get in our cars and drive to the beach. We could try and find ways to kind of keep ourselves entertained, or maybe our children entertained. And they had a massive push of tourism in those 2 summers that I would say had a strong, and I don't think it's too far for me to say, a negative impact on the community in lots of ways. So there are 2 sides to every story. They're also really close to the Greater Toronto area and to lots of big cities, so Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, and they saw tons of in-migration. So lots of people selling their homes in cities and moving to their rural community. Again, not without its challenges. They also saw lots of new investment, and I'll talk to you about a few of them. And with a traditional agricultural base, Prince Edward County is more than just Picton, Wellington, and Bloomfield. And we got to know lots of other people in communities that didn't feel as prioritized as the 3 communities of Picton, Wellington, and Bloomfield. Here are 3 really interesting new investments. The one up at the top, has anyone heard of Base 31? I hadn't. It was brand new to me. So Base 31, there's an old Army base there, military base there, I should say, and it's now being converted. So if anybody's heard of the company called Artscape, they did the Distillery District in Toronto, they did the Wickwood Barns, they've done a lot of projects where they look at creative placemaking. They've purchased this site, and now they have a whole master plan that they're putting in place for how to recreate this site with a combination of housing, arts, community, and business. It's going to be a fascinating project to watch. One of the first things that happened is that a really popular restaurant in Toronto called The Drake moved to the Drake, Devonshire. They moved right onto the water in Wellington County. So this was a big move that changed the narrative in Prince Edward County. And now you've also seen the redevelopment of an old hotel. I know in our community we have an old hotel that could use a lot of love, but somebody took on this project at the Royal, and they've opened a really fancy hotel in downtown Picton. So we got together as a team because what we were hearing from our colleagues at Thrive PEC is that, as much as all these developments were happening and the investment was happening, there was also a feeling in the community that things had changed and that the pace of change was so fast that it was problematic. And many people were feeling left behind. So there was a combination of things happening. So we said, okay, we'd love to come and talk with your team. So here's what we did. We worked with them and we did 7 community meetings and then 20 key informant interviews where we followed up and talked to people. And we used that model that Heather was referencing, this idea of asset-based community development. And it's kind of a cool approach, because if I were to say to you, hey, what's wrong? You might say, oh, I drove here in the snow today, or, I didn't get my snow tires on, or I didn't have time to cook something for dinner last night. You might answer that question and frame it in, the negative. But if I said, hey, what's going on in your life that's great? You might choose to answer that question a different way. So the framing of asset-based community development flips the narrative on its head and asks questions a little bit differently. And Zita walks us through this process. And, you just want to follow Zita because she's got a great way of explaining things. And these are the kinds of questions that we were asking people. And you can think about your own community here, different communities that you're part of. And I love these questions. So what do we currently have? What do we love? Because if I were to say to you, what do you love about this place? You'd probably be able to answer something pretty quickly. What would we miss if it wasn't there anymore? So if that disappeared tomorrow, what would we say? Oh gosh, we really miss that. And what will we do? So these were kind of the guiding questions that we used as we were going into this process. And then it got a little more interesting, right? Because we always go down to the next layer. And so we asked people to map out, like literally on pieces of paper, we had them write in, what are the economic assets you have? What are the built form assets? So what are the buildings? What are the cultural assets? What are the natural assets? And what are the organizational assets? And in Prince Edward County, these are what our maps started to look like. So I wanted to show you one of them because natural assets are obviously really important to things in Prince Edward County. So people said, what are all the things we have? Well, we have bird song. I love that one, right? That was a new one I hadn't heard before. We have master gardeners. We have something called Seedy Saturday. We have clean air, and we don't have any tall buildings. So these were the ideas of how do you take what you have and then begin to map them onto your economy. So how do you create something out of those assets? So this is the natural assets, but you can also add people into the mix. So one of the other things we started to do was called people mapping. And you probably, I don't know if, I hadn't heard that term before, but I thought it was really cool. So we've actually started to do it in Guelph because I can't resist, because I get involved in my own community. And it's this idea of, and today it would be really kind of fun if we had, I know we don't have time, but if we had time, to actually people map your economy. So what are all the organizations and businesses in the room? What are their mandates? What are their missions? What are their goals? What do they care about? And what are they doing about it? And how are they connected with each other? So it's really beginning to unlock what you have. And this idea started, really looking at neighborhoods that were in trouble, like where things were wrong. But again, if you always sort of look to the positive and say, what is right and what can we do about it, it begins to flip things around and people begin to come at it with solutions, which is what today is about, rather than problems. And it's not about being Pollyannic, right? That's the criticism. It's not, but it's about saying, look, we can complain about this a whole bunch, or we can try and find ways of looking for answers and solutions. So we did this mapping and oh my gosh, people came out in droves. We went to rural communities and talked to farmers, we talked to kids, we've engaged with Indigenous communities, talked to business leaders and developers. We've talked to the whole range of people. And I want to show you, I think I'm going to look to our tech. I'm going to show you a short video of some of the people that we spoke with. So it's about 5 minutes. And it'll give me a chance to have a sip of water too.
We definitely didn't have a lot of people paying attention to us. We were kind of just on this rock in the middle of the lake, like we were living on this island and we were sort of stuck out here.
When I crossed the bridge, I could feel time slowing down. I could feel a shift in the energy of the place and the way I felt. And I think whether people notice or not, that's the thing that binds it all together.
The longtime residents have kept this place beautiful, and they have kept community alive for such a long time. And so there's wisdom there. And that is a huge asset.
So Prince Edward County is roughly the physical size of the city of Toronto. So it's a large geography, but a small rural population, concentrated in a few small towns, a bunch of villages, and a lot of rural development.
And as more people sort of moved here and had success and were developing the tourism industry, more people piled on, and all of a sudden, more growth, more growth, more growth.
We have a very rich community with deep poverty at the same time. So there's a lot of divisions within our community, who got here last, who's been here forever, who is feeling a benefit from this economy and this growth, and who isn't.
Thrive is a community-led process of discovery and planning for the future of Prince Edward County that evolved through participation in SureFast Community Economies Pilot. SureFast Pilot aimed to answer the question, how do we strengthen community economies?
The county's popularity grew tremendously, as you know. We were being inundated with developers, all sorts of proposals all the time. The aspects of this pilot and looking at community economics would be a radical change from the way economic development had ever been done here before. And it was really felt that this was time that we really had to take control of this ourselves.
we talk about human resources and natural resources, and then we talk about assets. And actually, I think we have it exactly backwards. Humans and culture and nature, those are our assets. Money and financial capital, those are resources that we need to figure out how to deploy in the proper development of the assets.
What do we have? We have an amazing and rare intersection of culture and nature in a way that helps each other. This is not a wild place that has been untouched in someone's imagination. This is a place that has hundreds of years of history of many different people, intersecting with an area that still has rural charm and an abundance of the natural world. That's rare, it's unique, and it's disappearing. That's what we have.
Thrive have begun community-engaged conversations, providing opportunities and space for diverse stakeholders to uncover mutual issues and objectives with the community.
I think that when people think about communities, because it's another one of these words, it's a bit like economy, everybody's got a different understanding of what it means. Nobody, anywhere, ever built a future based on what they don't know and don't have. But everybody has something, and every place has something. And I've never believed that expression. I believe it when I see it. That's wrong. You will see it when you believe it.
My hope personally for the county in 10 years is that it continues as a vibrant community. It has a level of engagement of the community in terms of its future. And this sounds like, sort of a big wish, but where no one is left behind in a way that people currently feel that they are.
People watch the fields that they grew up with being empty fields get filled in by houses, but on the other side of that, this is an incredible opportunity for us to, sort of recognize some of the issues that we have with infrastructure, with the community, and take that and use it to create some urban plans that will lead to a better community for tomorrow. Our ability to plan for a much better facility in town would allow us to then reap the benefits of that 10 years down the road.
One of the questions is, how do we strengthen community economies? And like I said, well, how do we strengthen community? It has to start there. We have to have harmony before we can even think to thrive economically, because everybody's insight is important. When you're talking about a community, every member of the community is important.
I think people should return to those common places where everyone is welcome with no exception.
There is actually incredible amount of value in making an effort to include everybody. And that may mean thinking way outside the box. And sometimes that just means shutting up and listening and feeling.
And the more voices you bring to the table, the more divergent it may seem on the surface. But there are always going to be things that folks can agree on. And maybe focusing on those areas of agreement instead of focusing on those areas of divergence could help us at least look after that sense of community. At the core, we want to be healthy and well, we want security, and we want to feel connected to our social environment. So what does that look like? When you love where you live, you really want to see it succeed. You want it to be what it can be. And that doesn't mean a faster version or a newer version. It just means we have all these folks who are really willing to spend their time and energy on making town great.
To learn more about Thrive PEC and join the conversation, visit thrivepec.ca or email us at contactus@thrivepec.ca. To learn more about Shorefast's community economies work, visit shorefast.org.
So we were really lucky during this pilot project to be able to capture some of the work we did with communities. So you saw some of those busy rooms where people were getting together. We were really blown away by the response. And I think part of the question that was asked earlier is what's changing in communities. And what we saw, at least in Prince Edward County, was a real appetite to reconnect and to talk to neighbors. People live far away from each other in the county in many cases. And we were really struck by the vision that came out as people began to share what their assets were. We followed up with interviews and asked them what they see the challenges at the same time. And now we're trying to kind of connect some of the dots. And to say that this work is messy, there's never a truer word said. Community work is hard, and boy, it's super messy. And we've had a lot of moments where we've all just kind of thrown up our hands and said, what do we do next? And I say we because they sort of adopted me into the county as part of this project, where I began to sort of feel that commitment to seeing the change that they wanted to build within their community. So I put up their vision, and we're testing these now. So this is what came out of the interviews and the asset mapping exercise. And what we've said is we have a commitment now to go back and talk to people and say, did we get this right? So affordability is huge. A strong workforce and creating jobs. So not just in the tourism sector, but also in other sectors. So how do you diversify your economy? Remember I was telling you those stories about kind of those traditional manufacturing bases, and they used to have a lot of canning happening in Prince Edward County. Those plants have closed, and it has meant that there aren't as many jobs as there used to be, and the jobs that they do have in many cases are seasonal. They don't pay terribly well, and the impact of that is that they're seeing real estate prices go up and up, and it's really, really hard for young people to stay in the county now because they can't afford to live there. And I was shocked to hear some of the stories about employers and what they have to do now in order to attract employees, building housing, which is something outside of the agricultural sector, I hadn't heard of that before. So they talked about really wanting to create kind of proactive tourism strategies that managed growth sustainably, not just from an environmental perspective, but from a community perspective as well. And the sensitivity to the environment was huge there, and that's why I showed you the nature asset map is really a proactive climate action plan where they're making sure that their parks and their environment is being well preserved. And they also want to celebrate, and I love this one, they want to celebrate kind of the community's rich culture and heritage and acknowledge and build on their Indigenous history as well and heritage. Investing in parks and access, certainly access to services is a massive issue in communities. And they have this interesting problem where they have a growing community of young people coming in at the same time as schools are closing and there aren't daycare spaces. So there's a real tension there. So as much as people see Prince Edward County as a great place to visit and have a terrific glass of wine, and there's really lovely things to do there, for the residents of Prince Edward County, part of what they want to talk about is how do they build an economy that actually speaks to the challenges that their community's facing. So we mapped out some recommendations, and part of it was really activating the network through Thrive PEC and getting people connected. Also seeking alignment, and those partnerships become really important in working closely with their municipality, the other not-for-profit associations and businesses. And part of what they're going to do in the new year, and maybe many of you will join also, is they're going to bring some speakers together and have a community symposium to talk about some of these ideas, and really focusing now on fostering economic diversity. I just have a couple more slides as I'm wrapping up. So one of the models we're exploring with them, and I told you this was my 2022 goal, was to build this idea of community wealth building in everybody's minds and hearts, is really just a new approach to how do you keep wealth sticky? And I like that word because it stays in my mind. So rather than leaving your community, how do you keep wealth sticky in a place? And it's about taking all of these kind of one-off ideas that we have, connecting them all, and this idea of supercharging them. And I want to just quickly highlight the 5 pillars that we're working on now in partnership with the Democracy Collaborative around this idea of how do you create economies in places. So, it's building things like co-ops and social finance that we talked about. It's partnering with anchor institutions, and we all have them, hospitals, municipalities, higher education institutions, and looking at their purchasing power, because I know my university buys a lot of stuff. We're an employer and we purchase a lot of stuff. So, and lots of those places and hospitals and schools buy things, and how do you create an economy around that? And also this idea of land trust. So how do you hold land for a community that's safe and affordable? So these are the 5 pillars. And if you're interested, I can send you more information about this 5-pillar approach. These are just some pictures of projects that are happening in Canada right now. This is a community group in Parkdale, Toronto, a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood where the community came together and they raised a bunch of money and they worked with Van City Credit Union and they purchased a property to create and sustain affordable housing. And they have a number of properties under their purview now. Windsor, Essex, I mentioned at the beginning that project between Windsor and Detroit, that bridge, they've created something called a community benefits agreement, which was actually community getting together in order to say this is what we need. And if this big multi-billion-dollar investment is going into our community, we're being impacted on both sides of the bridge. So there's been a $10 million investment in both sides and a number of job training programs that have also been put in place to hire local people as this bridge is getting built. And the other one is in my hometown. It's in Guelph. It's this idea of social finance. And my good friend Julia Grady purchased a building, $3 million building, and they were a not-for-profit organization. And she raised over $1 million in community bonds. So it's this idea of how do you invest in community and how do you make a local investment? And she's an unbelievable speaker and person to connect with to talk about this idea of how do you then use the Not-for-Profit Act, which she's allowed to use, in order to raise capital to purchase a building. And now it's become a really active community space. And just last week, we did a panel with Habitat for Humanity, Guelph Wellington, and they're now using community bonds in order to build affordable homes. So it's this way of, we all, if we're lucky enough, we get to think about our futures and our investments, and maybe we buy something through our RRSP or something in a GIC. This is a different way of investing back into your communities and to be able to get a pretty decent return on your investment and that your money stays in that community. So it's that idea of keeping wealth sticky in a place. And my very last slide is really just, how is this work happening? And I think the message I want to leave you with is, I won't go through all the points one by one, but I want to say that the work is messy and it's uncomfortable. And very often there are leaders that emerge. And sometimes it's somebody really unexpected. And I think you have to support those people and get behind them. And I think a number of voices need to be heard at the table. And then just the last point I want to raise is really around this idea that incremental action towards something is often better than just waiting. It is completely imperfect. The number of things that I know we've tried in communities I've lived in, it's good just to get started on things. And I think the last sort of image I want to leave you with, it sort of goes back to the first point, which is what happens when that third pillar is broken. And I think it's time that we begin to think about repairing that third pillar in our communities to bring community into the conversation around economies. And those were the ideas I wanted to leave you with today. So thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun speaking with you. I'm happy to take questions or have a chat about anything. So I'm looking to Bonnie, and I think she's the one with the microphone. I'd like to pretend I'm Ellen. I love that. You're going to run up and down the aisles?
Because I need the exercise. Okay, so now we need somebody who has some questions, thoughts, or ideas. Come on, let me move her. Oh, Art Gibson.
Do you seriously think the only community is broken? The business community is broken and government's broken?
I think it's a... I think the point no, so that wasn't the topic. So the clear answer is absolutely no, but it's the opportunity for the three of them to work in harmony. And the reason things aren't working is that businesses aren't thinking, if you have an economy that only thinks about sort of profit and building businesses, it actually forgets that there are people that live in places. And I think that's where some of the fractures are happening. So in a highly extractive capitalist economy, which we live in, what we've seen is that it's fostered deep inequities. It's led to the climate crisis that we're in now. So there are absolutely problems with these things. So the theory is really, if you build community voices to actually begin to talk about the challenges that communities are facing, it helps all three pillars. So no, I wouldn't say there's anything perfect in the other two. It's a good question. Thank you.
Audrey, you definitely speak my language. I have a question for you. Can you speak to how your groups have engaged municipal government?
I love working with municipal governments, and the thing I've learned is that they all have a really different personality. And they have different challenges, I'll be really honest. I mean, we've just come through a municipal election where we've seen probably one of the lowest voter turnouts. where we've seen a level of disengagement that I don't remember seeing in my time of following municipal politics. And, that's happening at a time where municipal issues have never been more important. In our community, we're really focused on circular economy and food waste. It's a really big issue for our community. And it's really, really complicated. So municipalities absolutely need to be at the table. Some of the messages I hear from economic developers and mayors and city councillors is we can't do this work alone. And I'll speak very frankly to this room. And I love when people say we can't do this work alone because it sort of opens the door to bringing other people to the table. The flip side of that is also that often municipalities, who works for a municipality here? Anybody? Okay, great. I love it. Sometimes can be really risk adverse. And you have to look at a number of different constituencies in your work. It's complicated, right? It's hard to work for a municipality. You are on the front lines of your community, and people tell you a lot of things wherever you go. It's probably hard, if you're known in your community, to work for a municipality. So it's a huge amount of responsibility, and I totally agree that municipalities can't do it alone, but I think where we struggle is that we don't necessarily have kind of those architectures for collaboration or those governance structures in place to support municipalities in ways that they need it. There's municipal committees, there's community committees, and sometimes they don't intersect terribly well, and it's one of the problems we're trying to solve. I would not say we have the answer, but it's something we're looking at, and I'm glad you asked the question, Bonnie.
And I don't think that we're not making those attempts by any means in Huron and Perth County, but of course there's always room for to continue to build. But I think some of that does happen around some of the pressing issues, for example, around housing. I'm just pulling that one off the top, but thank you very much for that. Is anybody? Okay, this is where I get to act like Ellen DeGeneres.
My question is, it was brought up as well, I think it was Heather that was talking, I think that's the right name, but the first woman who was talking about, I've been in this community for 17 years, and I'm just now feeling like I'm a part of the community. Well, there's also another side to that. I've lived in this community my whole life, and I don't have the right name. I'm not from the right family. Everybody knows my family. I'm just using it as an example. Not necessarily my family, but I come from the wrong side of the tracks. You people are nothing but problems. Now you have a business in our town, or you're trying to do this social enterprise or whatever. We don't want you involved. We may not say that, but we're just going to kind of sideline you. Like, I'm a recent, resident of Huron County. I'm actually from a different county, but not too far away. And they're becoming much more community-oriented in their businesses as well. But there's one particular business that's there, and the response and there happened to be in a business field that I'm trying to expand into, is, well, if they would stop doing that, they're bringing these people here and bringing down the community. Yeah, how do you get around that?
Do
you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, I'm part of this community too, or this person is doing a lot of really good things, but there's that attitude of, why is she bringing these people here? When the truth is, these people have been here the whole time. They're part of the community. So I'm just wondering, like, not just in that situation, but in others, where people don't want you involved. How do you work around that?
It's a great, Heather, I don't know if you want to take it. I think Heather has something to say.
I think in terms of developers feel that way, right? In my town, we have a developer coming in and nobody wants them. And we don't want development, we don't want you. That developer lives in our community. Right? So developers feel that same way. I don't think there's a magic way. I have a philosophy, kill him with kindness. And the best way to deal with a bully is to compliment the bully and to befriend the bully. So the more you say, with a bully, this is the philosophy is, you did a really good job presenting today. The bully's not going to come back to you and say, you suck.
because you just complimented them. And so I kill them with kindness. That's the only way I can think about, and being strategic and saying, you know, I see your business with this and this. My angle is this and this. And, you know, how do we work together and come together? It's going to be hard, and community work works at the speed of trust and relationships. That's the foundation of community work. And so you need to build trust and relationships with the enemy somehow, some way, to be able to work together. But developers go through this all the time. Nobody wants them, right?
Mm-hmm. The only point I'd add to that is sometimes you can also work through existing organizations too, and to create change from within. And I've seen that work in some cases. I was mentioning sort of the BIA and different associations that are part of the community, and often to get involved in those and then to work from within to create change, because I think there's often those sort of us and them tensions that exist in communities, or maybe the fear of the outsider or the newcomer. And I really like your point about sort of the speed of trust. And I think at the end of the day, it's often about people and relationships. And I think, you know, it's really hard to be, you know, nasty to somebody when you're standing face to face and having a conversation with them, and you try to get to know a little bit about their world as well. So I've seen some of that work, and communities are changing right now. And I think organizations that many of us are part of have the responsibility to try and build some of those bridges across differences as well.
I noticed some of the exciting work you did with PEC looked to have taken place recently.
Mm-hmm.
I know something I'm struggling with in my day-to-day work is how to gather people in this COVID world we're living in. You know, how do you market local initiatives? How do you reach out to people in order for them to come out to these churches and busy places in the first place? Was there any marketing strategies that you felt were really effective in having people gather in order to have these really important conversations?
Mm-hmm. I was blown away by the response, and we didn't know what to expect as we kind of gathered in town halls and church basements, and we really relied on people, and it was a person-to-person strategy. So I think you put your hand up for working for a municipality. It's really leveraging the people that you know in your network and asking them to ask people. It was a bit of a neighbor strategy too. So we had people say, can you ask your neighbor? Can you drive your neighbor? Because it was during COVID, and, you know, even today, you know, we're in that space too, we were really careful to put protocols in place. We did offer digital follow-ups with people for interviews as well, so we tried to be as accommodating as possible. And it was astonishing, and what we were surprised by was people really like to be asked their opinions, right? And they love to talk about where they live. And it's so fun, and it's such a privilege to hear those conversations. So, you know, whatever, and we're doing a new project now with another community, and we're using those 4 questions, like, what do you have? What do you love? What would you miss? And they're, you know, I think anytime you're putting something together, you know, and you have a researcher there, like, it can feel a bit daunting. So I think if you can put the questions out in advance and say, these are the kinds of things we'd like you to respond to, I think that can kind of take some of the temperature down. And then we also did kind of the usual online social media outreach, but we really found that the in-person meetings were the way to go. And it was sort of that, you know, you tell your friend kind of strategy. And it was quite good. And then what it did is it created a little bit of momentum. And then all of a sudden people were, have you heard that? My kids use the term FOMO. So it's okay. So fear of missing out. So then all of a sudden we had a couple of meetings, and people were like, I didn't get invited to that meeting. So it was actually kind of fun. And we're like, we're happy to come back and do another meeting. So it created enough of a buzz, or that FOMO feeling, where people felt that something was happening. So the first couple of meetings, I would say, were probably harder. And then we started to build. And we did do one specifically with council and mayors. Or the mayor and councillors, sorry, I should say. And that was really fun to talk to people around that group to get their ideas. So we definitely brought the municipality along. And it was neat because the mayor kept coming to all the meetings, and he just kept showing up and listening. It was really fun. And he didn't always participate, but he showed up and he listened. And I think that was a real signal to the community as well.
That was an excellent question. I know now, after COVID, I have the fear of going out sometimes. Someone else. Okay, one more question, and then we're going to have a break, everyone, because I'm sure you want to all get out of your seat.
Hello. I either have 2 interrelated questions or 1 long question, and I
Do I need a pen?
I don't know which it's going to be. I'm just going to start talking
Go
and
for
see
it.
how it turns out. My ears perked up in your presentation when you talked about feeling adopted by the community. How do you cultivate that authority and authenticity within the community when you're an outsider? Part two. What is so? I think that the work that you do is disruptive by nature. You're disrupting the things that are going on in the community already. Do you experience pushback from people who have that authority within the community, and how do you deal with that?
What great questions.
Thank you.
Wow. I love those questions. The first one I really appreciate because I'm a community engaged researcher. I work with a lot of communities, so I think hard about what I'm stepping in with when I go places. And what I've learned, and I wasn't always this way, I'll be really honest, because you have to share a little bit of yourself. And I'm not always really good at that, and I'm working on that, so it's hard. And then I learned that if I share a little bit about myself, and I didn't grow up in a rural community, and I'm working a lot with rural communities now, but I did grow up in a really complicated place that actually didn't have a lot of community connections and social cohesion. And what I learned is that at the end of the day, communities are more alike than they are different. And even though I grew up in a big city, I grew up in a small, like a place within that. So I try to bring that voice into what I do and just connect with people and tell them a little bit about myself. And then I also listen a lot. And one of the things, and you'll see probably in how we even presented the vision, is, the last thing we just had a meeting in Bloomfield a couple of weeks ago, and we presented this, and I was so nervous. So I thought, oh my gosh, I'm coming out to show all these findings. And we did it in a way that said, did we get it right? Is something missing? Is something wrong? Do you want to give us some comments? So it's never a fait accompli. It's never, this is it. It's always a question. So I found that's sort of one of the ways that I'm testing, working within communities and listening a whole bunch. So that was your first question, and I forget the second one.
Just about, is your work is disruptive, and that can often be messy with people who kind of like the status quo or feel connected personally with the building of the status quo, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I like that question. I often, probably in a similar kind of way, by showing up and being honest. I have a personal motto, and it sounds really weird to say out loud, but I do say it all the time. I say, when in doubt, tell the truth. And it's kind of, see, it sounds kind of funny, but when you think about it, it works in most situations. So I will go into meetings and say, this is kind of uncomfortable, and I'm here asking these questions, and I understand this could be really challenging. So I kind of own that truth when I go into places, and I acknowledge it, and sometimes that can go a long way to de-escalating a situation. And I'm also really respectful of the context people are working in, whether it's a municipality or a developer or a community group or somebody brand new, a young person. I try to respect their context and learn it a little bit. So it's imperfect. And I think by acknowledging that, it sort of goes a long way to say, I have maybe it's because I have a degree in conflict management. I do my master's in conflict management and community-based conflict management. So I have this visual in my head, right? So when people are fighting, they're like you're sitting opposite. So when I go into a community, I try and sit beside somebody, literally and figuratively. And I think when you sit beside someone, you can try and have a different conversation. So that's maybe how I do it. Thanks for asking that. I hadn't really thought about that. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to answer that question.
Thank you for answering.
Yeah.
So that's it.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you so much.